All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Timmy Chow. I'm the Community Outreach Lead at the National Parole Transformation Project. Just a real quick note of logistical note before we jump into our session for today. We will be doing we have some amazing speakers that are here with us that we're going to have some programmed discussion and information sharing. And then after that, at the very end of today's session, we're going to open up for some discussion because we want to get have this be a collaborative group conversation. But for the first portion, we ask that you remain on mute just so we can make sure that our audio is clear for our speakers and the comments they have prepped for us today. So thank you. As I said today, my name is Timmy Chow. I'm part of the National Parole Transformation Project. We are a team that is housed within the MacArthur Justice Center, which is a civil rights law firm that's a national-based organization. The National Parole Transformation Project is a coordinated campaign of impact litigation and community-based advocacy, seeking to challenge parole systems that are kind of feeding mass incarceration. So throughout the past several months and the next couple months, we've been hosting these virtual teach-ins, spotlighting the parole-related issues in various states, including insights and perspectives from legal and directly impacted advocates that are working to advance parole reforms in their respective states. And they're really with the goal to illuminate the existing challenges that folks are facing, but also how communities are responding to overcome these barriers. So, all right, with that, I want to quickly introduce our incredible speaker lineup. We have Justin Martinez, who is the policy analyst and Bexar County project director over at the Texas Center for Justice and Equity. We have Amanda Rodriguez, legislative director with Texas House of Representative Jarvis Johnson. Mr. Robert Lilly, who is the participatory defense organizer at Grassroots Leadership. Savannah Eldrige, the co-founder and Coalition to Abolish Slavery Texas board chair, and member of Texas Incarcerated Families Association. We also have Jorge Antonio Renaud, National Criminal Justice Director and Director of the Southwest Region over at Latino Justice, as well as Marci Simmons, who's on the steering committee and community outreach and the community outreach coordinator at Lioness, Justice Impacted Women's Alliance. If you know how to, can we get some applause reacts for this amazing lineup of speakers that is about to drop us some really special knowledge today? Cool. If you can't see it, speakers, there's applause going on in the audience. All right, so I'm going to kick us right off because we want to be really streamlined with our time today because we have a lot of information to talk about and then try to get into some conversations. But Helen, oh, and how could I forget? Helen Gabler, who is my co-moderator for today. Helen is an attorney and over at University of Texas, who has been working with us, this crew, helping us move this conversation along. So Helen, I'm gonna first come to you and then pass it off to you for some other questions later. But Helen, during our first session, we really focused on getting a clear understanding of how the parole system was specifically functioning in Texas, as well as a clear picture of the major challenges with it. So I'm wondering if, to start us off, could you give us a brief recap of some of that information, just to kind of ground us and contextualize this conversation?
Happy to do so, Timmy, and I'm glad to be here, and I am also excited to hear from all of our panelists today. I'm going to keep it as brief as possible. The three things I think are important to know about parole in particular are, one, that in Texas it is a privilege, not a right, and so that is always going to come to the forefront in conversations around reform is that there is no right to parole. It is a privilege. The second is that with few exceptions, the incarcerated individual never has the opportunity to appear in front of the parole board or to really have an opportunity to provide their own input unless they can submit a parole packet, but they don't get a chance to speak one-on-one with the board. The third is that the board, there's a very complicated matrix of factors and decision-making factors and kind of a calculus that's supposed to go into board decisions, but the reality is it is extremely subjective, notwithstanding this kind of machination. And so it's important to remember that the board does tend to rely very heavily on backward-looking factors and not so much on forward-looking factors. And so things like the nature of the offense or the age at the time of offense are always going to rise in the board's determination, and more so than perhaps the work that has been done going forward. Procedurally, it's a pretty straightforward process. For the most part, individuals will come up every year. There are exceptions to that. You can get 1, 2, 5, 10, you can get, different set-offs, but when most people, in our experience at least, is that they come up every year. They are reviewed by a panel of 3 voters, but it's not like everybody sits in a room together and has a conversation about it. It's one voter at a time. After 2 people agree, then the third person really never even votes. And then the third is the board will rely almost entirely on paper records unless the person has submitted a packet or has an attorney to submit a packet and present in front of the board. Most of the board's decision-making will be based solely on what they get from the institutional parole officer and from the paper records. And so if it's not in, if it's not in front of them, they're not going to review it. And so I guess in the final piece I would say is there's not any written directive. It's not like they issue a written parole decision. You're going to get very basic information. You get, nature of the offense is why you're denied, or the history of offense history is why you're denied. And that's all you learn. You don't understand what you need to do differently for the next time up to succeed on parole. You don't get any additional information beyond the most cursory feedback. And so that, I think, is kind of maybe the most important point. I'm sure I've missed a lot, but I think to get us started, that gives us a picture of kind of what we're working with.
Thanks, Helen. That was really concise. Appreciate it. And I do think you did a great job of those key areas of big challenges that we see both obviously in the Texas parole system, but those also mirror and reflect a lot of the challenges that folks are facing with parole in a lot of other states with discretionary parole. So with that, I want to pivot to you, Savannah. One of the big threads that I think with criminal legal systems across the country is this idea of rehabilitation. I know that's come up in some of our conversations within this group. And, I know there's the conversation around what Texas, the parole system is claiming to do versus what it really is doing. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that and, if you'd like to speak to that piece.
Right. Thank you. So one of the things that we've seen, not just in Texas and other states, is that, there's been this huge push as rehabilitation versus punitive or punishment, right? And we know, as Helen said, that the board is subjective. And I think there's a disconnect between who's actually making the decisions and who's actually viewing and experiencing the changes that people on the inside are making, right? And so you have the board who are actually making the votes, and then you have, the people who actually work in the prison who are interacting, with the incarcerated individuals every day and are really seeing the way that they're working the programs that are available. And so when an individual gets a decision like, to the static factor, which really lends them nothing to essentially hope for, it's very hard to help them realize like what next steps really look like. What does the treatment plan really look like? What are the goals and what are the interventions when we're looking at educating or re-educating someone to prepare them for re-entry back into the community? And so what I hope for is for the parole board essentially not only to reevaluate the responses, but also incorporate a mechanism where there could be some, interventions or actions to give those who, have essentially, laid everything on the line, next steps for, whether you're set off for a year, 3 years, 5 years, whatever the time frame. These are the specific steps that you need to take, maybe some specific programs that might be suitable for the individual to work toward getting back home. And the larger issue also is that a lot of the folks that I've worked with, they've had issues getting into the programs as well. So again, when looking at rehabilitation, one of the hugest issues even in the community is access, right? Whether it's access to mental health resources, programming, treatment needed, but the programs that are being made available need to be evaluated for effectiveness. And conversations like these are super important because, who better to be a part of those decisions than individuals who actually gone through those programs to help improve them.
Thank you, Savannah. I think you did a great job of flipping that and showing how this is the way that system operates really is anything but rehabilitative, and is really not providing any sort of kind of guidance and support that it's claiming to. So thank you for that. Now I want to move to Mr. Robert Lilly. Robert, now I know you have firsthand experience navigating this process. So I want to open it for you to, just based on your own experience and navigating that process, could you speak a bit to how you would describe that process itself, and how that's kind of impacted your process of since being released, since getting out of prison?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Timmy, and good evening to all of my distinguished guests, all of the visitors that are out there participating in this evening with us. If you would just indulge me for a moment before I get to the question, I just want to read a quick quote that kind of couches, I'm going to couch my thoughts and my hopes, my aspirations in this quote. It's taken from the Midwest Academy's training that I participated in twice over this last year. It's a definition of direct action organizing: the process by which people impacted by injustice take collective action to build power to win meaningful change in their lives and communities and transform our society. Organizing often involves winning changes in policy, practice, and resource distribution made by decision makers of public or private institutions. It is fundamentally about justice, grassroots democracy, and self-determination. And then they end this quote with this word: people have power outside of systems and agencies. With that said, when I was incarcerated, I'm 53 years of age. I spent this last time 4 years in prison. Prior to that, I was in prison in my mid-30s. These two experiences are contrasting because the first time I went to prison, I just waited for the door to open. I was in my mid-30s. I didn't really think much about what I was going through other than I wanted to go home. And they told me parole was the way to go home. But, I had a 12-year sentence. I ended up doing 4 years on that 12-year sentence. I just waited for the door to open. The first answer came back. They said no. I was told that they would probably bring me back up in a year, and they did. And the next answer was a yes. Didn't give much thought to that whole experience again until 15 years later, at the age of 49, I'm facing habitual felon prospects. So they were looking at giving me 25 to life on a 3rd-degree felony. And now the game has changed because I have the stakes are different, right? I'm 49 years of age. The prospects of possibly being in there a long time are not attractive to me. So when I get to prison, one of the first things I think to do is I need to figure out, well, how do you effectively get out of prison? Like, I mean, that seems like a logical question to ask somebody. So, last time I didn't ask that question, I started going around to my peers and I started asking them, what is the method by which we get out of prison? How do I make parole? And immediately I noticed something as I started getting the answers back. Nobody knew. Nobody knew what effectively would needed to be done in order to get out. And what do I mean by that? One guy would say something like, well, you need to get certificates for programs. You get a lot of certificates and they're gonna have to say yes. Another guy would say, go get college classes. College credits is better than just getting certificates. And so you got guys in there that got 100 Bible course certificates, and they think that those methods are going to release them. Another guy would say, well, don't get any cases. And another guy is listening to that comment says, nah, I seen a guy go home with 7 cases. And so from all of these various answers, I realized nobody literally knew what to do to get out of prison. So I thought, let me go to the law library to see if I could find some information in the law library. I went to the law library, and lo and behold, there was absolutely nothing available that I could access that definitively told me, do this, this, and this triggers a release date, or this triggers a likelihood that you're going to get released. And so I realized I was faced with a problem. I'm in a place where I'm sent to, quote unquote, be punished, be held accountable, to be responsible for the choices I've made. And they tell me that on the other side of that is release based on the mechanism of parole, but they don't tell you how to achieve it. So I dug into the law library, and in the law library, I started reading about old case law, and I got some glimmers of an understanding about some of the ideas that they wanted. And based on some of those notions, I made appeals to family and friends. And yes, we put together this parole packet, and I did make my first parole. But I believe ultimately that I was an anomaly, that what happened in my instance was not something that's easily duplicated. And so I learned that there was no rhyme or reason to how the process worked. And so literally, here's another example. I say this as I get ready to yield. I watched the men around me. Because I'm paying attention now. So I saw one man who had 6 denials, same answers every single time. And I asked him a question. Who have you written? Have you written anybody? Because at the bottom of the denial paper, it says that if you have any questions, write to the institution parole officer, and they're going to give you an answer of some sort. And so I would ask guys, have you written anybody? The overwhelming majority of the people I would ask that question to never wrote anybody. They just simply did like I did the first time. They waited for the door. They waited for the next answer, believing that they would do something, or just giving up hope. Just saying, you know what, I don't know what to do. They're going to let me out when they're going to let me out, and I'll go home. And so to me, one of the hopes that I have for this conversation and my being here tonight is that we would eventually, through these kinds of dynamic kinds of conversations, remove the false hope that people inside have for this prospect of parole as it's being purported to work, that if you do that in some way, if you go there and you be good, they're going to let you out. And the truth of the matter is that there's no, based on that last conversation we had on this first teaching, there is no rhyme or reason. The system is designed to be convoluted and confusing. And the more of this information we get out to the public, the better off our communities will be. And I think more of us will be activated to get involved in these spaces. I hope I said enough to address the question you asked.
Thank you so much, Robert. I mean, I don't think I could put it any better than that. And I think it's almost like the parole system is intentionally by design keeping folks in the dark without rhyme, with the information and resources of how to even attempt to benefit from that so-called mechanism of release. So
If I could just say one last thing, just one
Yeah.
last thing. I felt like I was in a maze and I didn't know where the door was. That's what it felt like, that you were in a maze and you just have to keep trying doors until eventually one door just may happen to work.
Yeah. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Robert. Now, Marci, I want to come over to you. I know you also have had the experience in navigating the parole process. And yeah, wanted to open up to you if you wanted to say anything more about yourself and then your experience navigating that process.
Absolutely. Thank you. So when I first got arrested, going back and forth with the DA, negotiating 8 to 10 months, my first offer was 40 years. I ended up signing for a 20-year sentence. And the reason that I signed for that sentence is my attorney opened up his laptop and he pulled up the parole eligibility chart in Texas. And he showed me, look, on this 20-year sentence, you're eligible for parole at 28 months. At that time, I had 2 children in diapers and I had 3 in middle school. And I could wrap my mind around 28 months. 28 months meant I didn't miss the youngest one's first day of kindergarten. I didn't miss the oldest one's high school graduations and these kind of things. And I signed for that based on that. Very similar to Brother Rob. When I got to prison, I enrolled in college. I'm asking everybody, what do I do to, and the ladies in there are, oh, this looks good for parole. I'm doing all of those Bible studies through the mail. I'm doing everything I'm supposed to. I'm an outside trustee. My disciplinary history looks great. I get eligible for parole, and my sweet mother, who knows nothing about the prison system or how things work, she calls and talks to the warden. And she says, my daughter's up for parole. What do we need to do? And the warden looks at my file and says, oh, she's an outside trustee. She's going to go home. So she tells my mother, tells my family, Marci's coming home. The warden said, the warden, the biggest person in the prison, is telling me that she's coming home. And at that time, my middle school age kids, are now in high school, and their mom's coming home. This is happening, And when that first denial came, the reason for the denial was the significant monetary loss in my crime. It was for a factor that I had no ability to change in any way. My family was devastated, but I got a 1-year set off. So then we were able to wrap our minds around that 1 year. The next year comes, same thing. Disciplinary looks great. I'm in college doing everything, and I get the same denial reason. Year 3, same denial reason. Year 4, same denial reason. By this time, my mental health went all the way down the toilet. I was feeling like I was lied to. I was tricked into signing for that time. I was going to be there for 20 years. My children were going to grow up without me. And my mental health just completely spiraled down. I finally did get a positive parole answer after my 10th year in prison. Then came home on parole, and I had to pay all those college fees back. I actually had changed parole officers several times, and about my 4th parole officer, where I had been making monthly payments on my college tuition from prison, which was about $3,000 that I owed, he said, hey, you can't travel anymore until that's completely paid off. So he hit me with that. And we, 2 years out of prison, struggled, and we made it happen, and we were able to pay that. And then part of my parole stipulation was also that I couldn't have a checking or savings account. So as I'm trying to get funding to go back to school and finish my degree, that's almost impossible without your own bank account. It has definitely negatively affected my life outside of prison. Fortunately, I have a large supportive family, and I just can't imagine navigating life on parole in Texas without that. And that's the case for the majority of people getting out on parole.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Marci, and also just learn. And I think a lot of folks don't know just how those stipulations, how those barriers just, it's almost like it's designed to set folks up to fail. It's almost like they're not interested in seeing folks succeed. So I appreciate you sharing that experience. And Helen, I'm gonna pass it over to you, who's gonna take us into the next section of our conversation.
Thank you, Timmy and Marci, Savannah, and Robert. It's so powerful to hear the stories of sort of how things really work, not on paper, but in real life. And now that we have a sense of what we're dealing with, sort of the dysfunction of the system here in Texas, I want to have us move to kind of thinking about some of the just to have a clearer picture of the framework of the policy issues we need to be addressing when it comes to parole, and sort of thinking about where to put efforts and attention going forward. So for that, I'm going to turn to Justin and Jorge to sort of talk a little bit. Justin, why don't you start us off? What do you think sort of some of the key levers are, the levers for trying to bring some change to the system as we see it?
Yeah, of course. And yeah, I mean, Savannah and Brother Rob and Marci, I think, really highlighted a lot of the sort of issues that need to be addressed in parole. And I think when we're thinking about sort of framing this, something else that's important to me is that, just like sort of I believe the sort of larger criminal legal system isn't broken, I don't believe parole is broken. I believe parole is another physical manifestation of our larger criminal legal system, full of the same rot that you see there, right? And I think that's important for me to sort of grasp as I look at parole. But I think, parole is also such a large and complicated system that I think organizing these issues is obviously important. And I think how I organize these is sort of looking in like 3 bucket areas, right? So kind of what happens before and leading up to the parole hearing, sort of what issues are present during the active parole process being the second part, and then third part being issues that are present sort of after the parole hearing. And I think, for me, looking at that first bucket, I think we talked a lot about sort of not having access to information, right? Incarcerated individuals, folks representing not having access to information, which means preparing for parole is that much harder. And that means that there's no meaningful path here in Texas for folks to challenge information. If there's stuff that's incorrect or might be missing or needs to be updated, that's not available. I think Brother Rob talked a lot about how there's just not a whole lot of you're not given a lot about the parole process here in Texas and how it works. And people incarcerated don't have any real agency when it comes to the parole process. There's no meaningful path when it comes to the parole process, right? And then sort of during that, so in that, now moving into the second bucket, I mean, Helen, I think you nailed on the big one. I mean, our parole board loves to masquerade as a sort of a resentencing body. I mean, they are solely focused on re-examining details surrounding the sentencing and crime of conviction, rather than putting their attention on what has happened post-sentencing. Who is this person now? What type of growth and transformation has this person been able to make despite being caged? And how ready are they for reentry, right? And then, of course, the parole determinations, which, I mean, we talked about, right? I mean, our board is allowed to base their decisions on very subjective factors, on their personal feelings, on over factors that people can't control, right? Rather than on sort of clearly defined factors, because right now you have tens of thousands of people who get denied parole, as you heard multiple times, based off of the same reason, and often based off of things that cannot change, that they cannot do anything about. And then I think moving into sort of that last bucket, everything afterwards, I mean, this was also talked about too, when we're talking about what you get afterwards. I mean, that they're only required to provide you a written statement that only has sort of, they're only required to put the decision, whether it's A approved, D denied, and then the reason, right? Which 2D nature of offense tends to be the most popular reason for denial. But yet there's no clear instructions for that person. There's nothing there to help that person have some type of tangible next steps when it comes to, okay, what can I be doing to overcome whatever factors led to my denial? And of course, reporting on parole is not very meaningful. There's not a very meaningful appeals process here in Texas either. We do have parole guidelines, but the parole board can deviate from those guidelines. And right now, the parole board's not required to give specific reasons as to why they deviate from those parole guidelines. And I think lastly, before I hand it back off, is coming back to sort of the macro level, I think while there are many aspects of the parole process that we have all highlighted here that needs to be addressed, I think that what we really need to be putting a lot of focus on is what would presumptive and administrative parole policies look like here in Texas, right? So coming up with the way in which we presume parole, and then also looking at really digging into how can we further guide and put further guardrails when it comes to how the parole board makes their determination, so they can't deny someone purely over something that is subjective, right? That these denial reasons need to be objective. And really the only reason why, in my view, someone should be denied is if there's clear evidence to suggest that there's something there that can't be mitigated by anything that's, resources or support that's out there within their community, right? And I think that is where, when we're talking about solutions and having a meaningful impact when it comes to parole, I think those things, the small but also the bigger stuff, we need to somehow figure out how to do in parallel with each other.
Thank you. That's a great overview of kind of some of the key areas that need, I think we all are in agreement, need to really be addressed. Jorge, you've worked at a national level and have written on these issues. Has anybody gotten it right, or at least better? Hopefully somebody has.
Yeah, thanks for that. I want to say thanks to the folks who've gone before and laid this great groundwork. Just a quick overview. I did 27 years in TCJE, did a 3 years of a 5-year sentence, discharged, came back on a 28-year sentence, did 7.5 years on that, did 4 years out, came back with a 60-year aggravated sentence, 1991, did 17.5 years on that one. On the last one I did, I had to do 15 flat, right? And it was my third time down for aggravated robbery, and I believed, it's pretty well everyone who knew me believed, and who takes the parole system believed, that I was pretty well going to die in prison, right? Third time down, aggravated robbery. I made my second parole. Each time I wrote my own parole packets, and contrary to what someone else said about you going to college and that keeps you in there, I got a couple of degrees while I was down, wrote a book, did a lot of stuff, and was paroled on my second time. And I think that just goes to show, though, the gulf between, to illustrate what some Robert said, there is no information as to what you should do in order to make parole. Your son has been down 2 times for aggravated robbery, comes back again to 17 years, they let him go. Marci's down to the first time down on a 20-year sentence, gets all these set-offs, right? You have no idea. So to kind of illustrate a little bit of something what Justin was saying about the reasons, right? I'm gonna drop a couple of links in the chat, if that's okay with y'all. When I was at the Prison Policy Initiative, I wrote something. They asked me to look at every state that was in the country and look at parole systems and look at the factors that the parole boards used. And we looked at quite a few factors, the buckets that Justin was talking about. We looked at while you were in prison, the factors that the parole board used, transparency, and I also looked at post-release factors. And we graded them, and and of course, as you would think, as you would realize, everybody failed. There was not one parole system in the country, and there's only actually 34 states that actually give parole. 16 states have totally outlined, I've totally outlawed parole. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you all just something for that. If you want to look at it sometime, feel free to. But one of the things that we found out was that the only way to actually give people an informative process was to do what Justin was talking about, other people were talking about, something called presumptive parole, right? Administrative parole or whatever. What that system says is that when you go into the system, they say, you're eligible here. If you give us A, B, C, and D, you will be released. And there's only one state in the country that actually has a meaningful presumptive parole process, and that's Michigan, right? New Jersey has somewhat of a presumptive parole process. Hawaii uses it some. Texas actually has it in statute, but they never use it. And the way that we were talking about levers to pull, right, stuff like that. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the levers because in Texas we know there's two ways in order to influence. People say the Board of Participatory Paroles, TCJE, and that's going to be either through policy, right, which is through procedural guidelines. In this case, the Texas Board of Criminal Justice and the executive directors of the TCJE and the Board of Participatory Paroles, and the other is through legislative fiat. And I will say that I want to point you out to somebody called Safe and Just Michigan, which back in the day was something called I want to say it's CAPS, which was Crime Citizens Alliance of Prison and Public Spending in Michigan. And they're the ones that push Michigan into presumptive parole. But not only that, Michigan is the only state in the country that has what Justin referred to, right? Which is which is the only way that they'll set you off on purely objective factors. They have been denied the use of subjective. In other words, they can't tell you that because of the crime, because you committed this crime, you can't get out. Because of the seriousness and nature of the offense, you can't get out. The only way that they will see you in Michigan and give you a review is if they're going to deny you parole. And at that point, they will tell you, you had these 7 things to do, 2 of these you didn't do, you do them in the next year, you get out next year, and we don't see you. Which means that some of the things that they used in order to create that alliance was some of the things I think we need to do in Texas. And by that, I mean, they had a huge reliance or a huge coalition of people, and they used faith leaders, which I think we need to align ourselves more with here in Texas. They align themselves with crime survivors. And by that, I mean, they got pretty tight with an organization called Crime Survivors with Safety and Justice, which a lot of folks here may be familiar with, but I want to give you all a link to that. And what that is what they do really well is they put out a report, and they put out a report in 2022 that said that they interviewed crime survivors across the country as to the biggest things that they wanted from people who were being considered for parole. And the 2 biggest things they said was, one, that we want to ensure that they don't do it again, and we want to ensure that we have a process toward healing. And I think that some of the factors that we need to argue along with our allies, we go before when we try to move the levers, right, of power that are influencing parole in Texas. Is that we have to tell them that does being in prison more, does being in prison longer help the healing of the individuals who've been hurt in this process? And by that, I mean that we need to bring crime survivors on board. Another thing that they did really well is they turned to, and you may think this is counterintuitive, and as an abolitionist, I don't necessarily agree with it, but they turned to law enforcement. And by that, they didn't necessarily turn to police or anybody like that, but they turned to the people who were sending us to district attorneys. And I want to give you all one more link here, and that link is going to be to a link to something called EXIT. It's something called Executive Transforming Probation and Parole. And they are comprised of hundreds of people across the country, including district attorneys, who understand that the parole process is not only broken, but that it is working exactly the way that it was intended to be, which is keeping mostly marginalized people, mostly people from Black and brown communities incarcerated, and yet they believe that there is a way out. And I want to give you all that. And I think that along with some of these resources, if we start tuning in and turning on some of the people in the organizations and the associations that are willing to help us and be in coalition with us, we can make better movement in Texas. One last thing that Safe and Just Michigan did. They had someone named Barbara Levine who was fronting it. We need to, in Texas, maybe it's David Gutierrez, who is the current member, who is the current ED of the board. We need to find somebody who's going to lead us through this process. But I don't mean lead us in the fact that they're out there telling us what to do. But we are in a very conservative state, and Michigan at the time also was. We need somebody to front us, who has not been through the system, right? Who we can present as who conservatives and people pushing back against us cannot find any one thing to say, well, no, we can't help you because. Michigan was very smart by getting Barbara Levine. Barbara Levine was a commissioner of the Court of Criminal Appeals there in Michigan. She was involved with parole and probation process for decades. And I think as long as we get some of those factors together, we get FIPs, we get incarcerated folks, right? And we do our research, that we can, in fact, make a huge difference in how folks are granted parole in Texas.
Thank you, Jorge. Yes to all of that. I have to say, and I want to bring Amanda into this conversation as well, along with Justin and Jorge. I'd ask you to stay in for this policy piece as well. I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting that you raise is that, the idea of having, a presumptive parole. We did have presumptive parole in Texas, and it was taken away. It became, instead of mandatory supervision, it became a discretionary mandatory supervision, which has become basically, it sort of is what you say, right? You're presumed to be paroled unless, and they have to come up with two specific findings, unless you're a danger in your community, unless your activities inside TCJE don't accurately reflect the rehabilitation. But what we know is that in practice, it's not how it's really exercised. In practice, it is treated just like parole, and it has the same subjectivities, it has the same discretionary biases that the parole system has. And so I guess from taking that into consideration, Amanda and Justin, you were going to talk a little bit about kind of some of the opportunities and some of the limitations on the kind of the process here of trying to create a movement for reform. And I think it's interesting to think about it in the context of, we have had some changes, but in the practice versus the reality versus, it is quite different. So, Amanda, you want to talk a little bit about the work you're doing and where you see some of both the opportunities and limitations?
Sure. I'd like to start off with just an appreciation for everybody who's here with us. It's after the workday and you all could have been elsewhere, but you are here because you realize it's an important topic worth your attention. And so genuinely from the bottom of my heart, I sincerely appreciate you all taking the time. I guess, where I'll start off with is, a lot of people, when they think of the legislature, they often think of, and I hear it all the time, how a bill becomes law, they refer to the Schoolhouse Rock tune of, how it goes, right? And many people do come here with the thought that it's a very linear process like that. You come up with an idea, you create it, it gets a hearing in a committee, it gets out of that committee, and so on and so forth. And while I would love to get into how the system is supposed to go, I've been here now for nearly 4 years, or actually 4 years now, and very rarely do I see it ever go that way. And that's not to sound cynical. I think it's just let's be honest. And so I guess what I'd like to say is, the process looks so much different for bills that seek to create substantive change, like what we're talking about, whether it be parole. For those of you who pay attention to Texas politics, that could also mean for healthcare, housing, teacher pay, so on and so forth. We live in a very interesting state in that way. And the things that I think could really benefit and are needing political attention often don't get that. And it's the things that really don't, that you see the attention going towards. And I know we talked about earlier about, yes, there have been some reforms passed, even way before my time. But since I've been here, because that's what I can speak to, the things that have been passed related to this topic, even the criminal legal system in general, the bills often that get the governor's signature are watered down. They typically have their teeth removed. And for those of you who are advocates and have been a part of that process, you know that we can come in to the game with a bill that really could do some great things. I mean, my boss, we had a parole bill, for those of you who know, it could really do some amazing things. But I spend most of my work and time trying to convince people why it makes sense that they should do something that they're legal, they being the Board of Pardons and Paroles, they being TCJE, that they should do what they're legally required to do. I even see like people in the comments, you know, including statute. The statute only goes so far when the person interpreting it doesn't really care for what it really was intended to. And what I mean by that is, if I create a statute to do something, and you know, there are agencies that will literally look at it and be like, okay, I will do the very minimal to comply with this statute, and that's it, no more. And that's it. It's all interpretation. So I wanted to, you know, kind of be honest about that, mainly because I know when we talked privately, I spent a lot of nights here. I mean, we work sometimes like 14, 15 hours a day, depending upon later in the sessions. And I spent a lot of nights with advocates, and they all, it always makes me happy to see people come in and maybe it's their first time speaking on a bill, and they're eager, they're excited. Many are nervous, very nervous. And I like when they come in and talk to me, because the goal is that I can make them comfortable with what they're about to do. But I think a lot of people come in without the acknowledgement that sometimes, you know, we always hear like, hey, go talk to your rep, go call your rep when you want something changed. Sometimes those people don't listen. And, you know, I've seen a lot of people come through, and like I said, they're so eager, and then they leave. And maybe the whole hearing lasted 8 to 10 hours. They were fighting hard, 8 to 10 hours of hundreds of people coming in and saying, hey, we don't like this. And then it takes legislators like 10, 15 minutes to decide, oh, we're going to move forward with this. And a lot of those same advocates that were once so eager coming in, I see them leave with their heads down. And I'm not saying all that to say that people shouldn't come. It's important. We need it. I am saying it, though, is that the legislature only meets 140 days every 2 years. There's a whole lot of things that happen in between that time. And I think one thing I just wanted to kind of mention, and before, you know, all of this ended, is that the fight must, and it's already been mentioned too, but the fight must continue in those in-between times as well. Your members should still, my boss, I'm on him all the time, you should still be fighting, even though you're not sitting there in front of a mic on the floor when everybody's watching. That's the stuff that really matters. Because a lot of the times, like I said earlier, your bills won't pass, but those boards, TCJE board, the boards of pardon and parole, they still meet, whether it be every month, every other month, or whatever, and they make decisions that very much impact their day-to-day business. And so, you know, I hate to put it this way, but the foot needs to stay on the neck, essentially. Because genuinely, I think that I see people come in as advocates all the time, and they're so knowledgeable about an issue. Like, I even think about my own uncle who's incarcerated. He knows more about that experience than I will ever know, because I've never directly lived it. But the people they listen to, they being the members here, the people they actually listen to aren't everybody on this call, are everyday people. They're the lobbyists, so the people who really have that influence. And so, yeah, I wanted to say, you know, it has to continue outside of just this body, outside of just this legislature. It has to. That was a lot. And so I don't know, Helen, if like I covered everything that you were seeking. And I'm always willing to answer additional questions. But I think those are some things I really wanted to mention. Oh, if I can mention one more thing. You know, a lot of the times here, my boss, I don't know if other members work this way, but as his legislative director, I know you were asking about what my day-to-day looks like. That means meeting with these directors that we're talking about. The Brian Colliers of the world, the David Gutierrez's of the world. And in those conversations, I start to realize how much of this is truly, we keep hearing the word arbitrary. It truly is. Genuinely, if they wanted to change this stuff overnight, they would. So I just want to make that clear. It's not a matter of not being able to. The legislature was working with the largest budget we've ever had. And oftentimes you hear people say in this body, oh, we can't do this because we can't afford it. Well, that excuse wasn't applicable this year. We could afford it. We just didn't do things. We chose not to. And oftentimes you hear TDCJ, Board of Pardons and Paroles as two separate agencies, which they are, but they very much intersect. And I'll give you one example before I close out. And I want to shout out like what I know, and that's my story, and that's my uncle's story. He is in AdSec. He spends almost all day in a cell and has for years now. His parole experience will look much different. And the reason I want to talk about the intersectionality is, yes, parole board does make the decision. But when people aren't given access to rehabilitate, and that is because of TDCJ, when they're not given access to an environment that's capable of encouraging them to rehabilitate, what are we doing? Because none of that is going to positively affect whether or not they're going to get parole. And then you look at the other side. If somebody has done all of those programs that they're asked, then they go in front of the board and they realize, oh man, all of that's for nothing because you're going to judge me based on something I did 20 years ago. What does that say about morale when they get back into those facilities and have to go around other people and say, man, what's the point? So they very much intersect, and we have to understand that when we advocate. Otherwise, we'll find ourselves in a very reactionary place like we always do rather than a proactive place. And that's where I would like us to be. So yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. That is hugely helpful. And I think that last point is especially important to keep in mind, that interaction. It's easy to separate out the two entities without sort of recognizing the role in which they kind of reinforce each other. Justin, do you want to talk a little bit about Sunset and some of the specific opportunities that maybe are here now?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, Amanda, you got me fired up. Yeah, I mean, I do want to also like put an exclamation on that and be like, as someone whose title is a policy analyst who spends most of my time at the state level, one of the truths that really hit for me this recently is that a traditional top-down organizing approach is not going to get us to the world we want to be in. And that we need to also, in parallel, really dig deeper into building critical connections with folks on the ground where we can come together to share skills, share knowledge, share struggle, and we're not putting all of our eggs at the Capitol, right? Because that's just not gonna get us where we all want to be. But speaking of Sunset, speaking of other ways in which we can get involved. So in Texas, for those of you who are not from Texas, we have this thing called Sunset, where essentially pretty much every agency goes through the process. And Sunset's basically asking, do we still need this agency? Can this agency be combined with another one for efficiency? Or they'll look at agencies and be like, what are the issues? What are the solutions? And then those get addressed during the legislative session, right? And Sunset's a pretty important process because, like last session, there were agencies that went through Sunset and 95% of what Sunset proposed passed the Texas House. So, Sunset is a very important part for us to advocate in, especially because, it only comes, I think, 10, 12 years, right? Not every agency gets evaluated every legislative session. But part of where we are now with Sunset is Sunset's in the process of sort of their beginning stages of looking at the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, the Board of Pardons and Paroles, Wyndham, which is the school district that TDCJ uses, and the Correctional Managed Healthcare, which is in charge of healthcare with incarcerated individuals. And they're gathering information, and this is the perfect point in time for people to get involved with that, because everything they're looking at now and everything they receive now is purely confidential. No one else will see it. No one else can request to see it. So if you have folks on the inside and you want to encourage them to help them become part of the process, maybe have some agency, they can write to Sunset, and all of that's confidential. But yeah, so this is a process that will be going on through this year. And then, of course, during the legislative session, we'll have all of that happening where there'll be plenty of opportunities for folks to also organize and advocate around as it comes to sunset. But yeah, it's just a really important part of the process. It doesn't come often. It's another way to sort of organize and advocate on these issues. And, you know, as a follow-up, we can certainly provide, you know, maybe more of like a detailed description of exactly how folks can get involved for those who want to and help you through that process. But yeah.
Thank you. I guess at this point, Timmy, I'm gonna kick it back over to you. We're running out of time, but hopefully people can stay on a bit longer and we can have more conversation.
Thank you, Helen. And yeah, just if we could get some love in the chat for all of our speakers so far. You know, Justin, Amanda, thank you so much for walking us through that process and also just for the really critical insights. I think one of the things that's really sticking with me and that resonates as our team is connected with advocates working on parole in various states is that our political decision makers across the board, when it comes to criminal justice reform, what it takes to really put forth and make radical reforms possible, that requires, as somebody mentioned in the chat, a broader cultural shift, right? It's a broader cultural political shift from the kind of tough on crime politics that really allows these political decision makers to get away with no movement on these issues and reform. As well as just sustained grassroots action, right? Sustained grassroots action and mobilization. So I want to, you know, first open up to our panelists. If you had any additional comments based on anything that was shared so far, and also since we are wrapping up pretty soon, let folks know that if you are interested in digging into this conversation, I know Robert, if you wanted to share that there is going to be a further conversation on this, and we have, for folks who registered, we'll be following up with everybody with the email addresses to share more details on that opportunity. But yeah, Robert, did you want to share more about that?
Yes, I'll be very succinct because I want to respect everybody's time, and I also like to see if there's any questions or comments from the audience. But one of the things when I was incarcerated was, first of all, I want to mention one thing I failed to say earlier. I have a brother that's been in there for 19 years. His name is Conrad Lilly. He is a mental health patient, and he effectively, because of his sickness, his mental health condition, he's denied the opportunity to see parole because every time he acquires an infraction, that basically sets him apart from being qualified to be reviewed. So he hasn't seen parole effectively for 5 years because all he have to do is adjust his custody level. Second thing I want to mention along with that is those officers inside have so much power. They can write you cases. Now, they won't give you parole, but if they write you a case, you're pretty much guaranteed to not get parole because that'll disqualify you. And so those officers in there who are not competent to make those kind of life and death decisions, they have far too much power to take the freedom of the opportunity for liberty away from us. The last thing, going to Timmy's point, for all of those that are listening and watching tonight, this conversation is the beginning of what we hope to be something more robust and meaningful around the way of parole reform in Texas. One of the things, we formed a study group when I was in prison, so men and myself, and we were digging into this subject, but we reached outside and tried to get information inside the prison context. And it was extremely difficult to find anybody to send us anything substantive inside the prison system. And so one of the things we hope to see accomplished out of this kind of discourse is information filtering into the prison system and more of us out. We know that there are groups doing work on parole, but what we have not yet seen is enough interconnected conversation taking place. And so we hope that after this, the goal is to create a container in which we can begin to have a more dynamic discussion about what parole reform could look like in Texas. And anybody that's willing to be a part of that, whether you're with an organization or not in an organization, you're welcome into that space. And so I just hope to see more people. I'll say this last thing and I'll close. When I look at the level of need and the challenge that we face. 120,000 people incarcerated, approximately 60,000 people every year getting released from prison on parole conditions. I don't yet see the kind of charge from the community that this circumstance demands. So my hope is that we can get people excited about this, because it is the only mechanism that people have in prison to acquire liberty. And I want to say liberty because according to the language of the law, parole is not freedom. It is conditional release. It is being set at liberty. You're not free. And so this is not the end of the fight. There's still more fights. I know Tara mentioned the sunset work that they're doing with Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice. That's work that we should be talking about as well. So I just want to say thank you all for letting me be a part of this conversation, because there's so much more to be said. In 1 hour and a half is not going to give us time to say it all, but I think we're off to a very good start.
Thank you for that, Robert. Could we get some, if this is something you'd be interested, a conversation you'd be interested in being a part of, would you mind just dropping that in the chat and letting us know that if that's something you'd be interested in being a part of? And while folks are doing that, I want to go ahead and pass it to you, Marci.
Thank you for that. I was trying to drop the link in the chat, and for some reason it's not letting me to the first conversation, because I was able to watch that yesterday, and that was kind of the beginning, the first teach-in, and I wanted to encourage anyone who missed that to go back and watch that. And then I just wanted to encourage everyone exactly where you see that. Thank you, Timmy, for that. It's in the chat. You want to definitely follow NPTP on YouTube, and you want to definitely share that. Change starts with conversations like this and awareness. And I think that everyone in this room probably knows that we have conversations with people about the change that needs happens, and they're clueless. They just didn't know. Simply education is just a huge part in it. So I just wanted to make sure, encourage everybody to watch those videos and share them.
Thank you, Marci. Well, towards the end of our session here, do any of our panelists or also any of the folks who are with us in the audience, if you wanted to speak to, as we look forward, any ideas on and comments or reflections based on this conversation on where we need to go. If you want to go ahead and you can use the raise hand function and we can go about it that way. Savannah, yes.
Hey, Timmy. Thank you. So I just wanted to really hone in on the fact that this is truly like a crisis, right? A community crisis. And I didn't really speak about it earlier, but I've kind of been dealing with parole, not having direct lived experience, but, and having two siblings who are on both ends of the spectrum, right? So one who's up for annual review and recently been denied a couple of days ago, and having to revisit what that looks like to encourage his children that maybe next year, and encourage my mom maybe next time, when they've invested so much, financially and emotionally into not just him, but his, reentry and the whole process. And then dealing with, another sibling who, is still on the long walk home. And I just want to encourage the family members, no matter what point they're in this journey, to get involved, because the changes that we make today are going to be beneficial, could be beneficial to you, your loved ones, but get involved, learn about the parole process, not only to educate your loved one, but so that you can be educated and know how best to support them, as they are, trying to fight ultimately to return home. So that's all I just wanted to add.
Thank you, Savannah. Jorge?
Yeah, I'm going to say very quickly, many things can be true at one time, and I caution folks against saying, oh my God, I was released because I had two vocational things and didn't do this, so therefore that's what you need. Or that person got 7 one-year set-offs because they didn't go to college, and I went to college maybe the first time. We could speak to our experience, but to tell someone else this is what you need to do, can oftentimes lead to a lot of broken hearts, man. So let's be careful about that, all right? And I want to thanks to the folks here who are willing to continue this process, and that we can, in fact, on down the road, not just, I'm an abolitionist, so I don't believe in parole in the first place. I don't believe in prisons, but we have what we have, and we are going to be able to transform it. But I want to say, until then, I would caution folks who have loved ones in prison to not say this is what you need to do to make parole. This is what you need to do in order to make yourself a better individual and stay the fuck out of prison. Okay? And let's try to couch guidance in that. Excuse my language, but I've seen too many people say this is what they need to do. Right? And they get out and they go back in 2 months. So let's try to focus on what we need to do to stay out while we go toward the larger goal of dismantling this entire system. Okay? Thanks.
Thanks so much for that, Jorge. And I think that last comment, I think too, is these are structural issues, right? And we can't make the mistake of individualizing this problem or acting like the blame or the solutions depend solely on any one individual, or that it is, and that actually that this is a collective issue, and that it is our political decision makers, these public institutions that are supposed to be offering resources and support to our communities, that this is a collective failure on their part too, and predominantly their part, that is leading to the lack of resources, the ongoing kind of separation, isolation, and dominance that these structures are having on our community. So thank you for that last comment, Jorge. And I'm not seeing any hands, so just a reminder, we will be following up for all folks who registered that there's going to be a follow-up working group conversation to strategize on how to continue this conversation, how to continue this work, how we can really, as Amanda referenced, the necessity of really how this needs to be a grassroots collective effort, right? We can't just leave it to the political decision makers to do this on their own moral accord. That is not, as we know, that's not gonna happen. And it requires sustained pressure as well as a radical envisioning of what needs to be transformed and how that's done. So thank you everybody for joining us. This has been a really insightful and inspiring conversation. So please, as we're closing out, if you want to give some love in the chat to all of our incredible speakers today, and stay on the lookout for this session will be recorded, as well as a transcript that will be made for folks, as Robert referenced. We'll as well as a transcript from our first teach-in, which you can find on the link that was dropped, which can also be mailed in and shared with loved ones inside, so that we can do our best to share this information as far as wide as possible. So thank you all, and thank you for joining us, and stay tuned to continue this conversation.
Everybody have a blessed evening and stay peace, man.
Thank you.